real good at picking his parents. If everyone would be so generous to please take your seats and we will proceed. If everyone would be so generous to find a seat. On behalf of the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, I'd like to welcome all of you to our midsummer review where we receive comments from His Excellency the Governor. Before we introduce the Governor, I would like to ask everyone to pause in just a moment of reverence and appreciation for the loss of an extraordinary public servant in the Commonwealth of Virginia that we lost at much too early an age, Dr. Melton. So if you'd join me in a moment of silence, please. Thank you. With that, if you would please join me in welcoming the 73rd Governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Honorable Ralph Northam.
Well, good morning.
Good morning, Your Excellency.
Chairman Norman, Chairman Hanger, Chairman Ware, Chairman Jones, Speaker Cox, members of the General Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the privilege of speaking with you this morning. I would like to recognize Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax. Thank you for being with us this morning. Also no stranger to me and you, the First Lady of Virginia, Pam Northam. Welcome. And also members of our cabinet. Thank you all so much for your service to the Commonwealth of Virginia. I am here today to update you on the Commonwealth's revenues for the just ended fiscal year, as we look forward to our next budget cycle and the choices we will make to ensure Virginia remains a strong and diverse place to live and work. We start out this new budget cycle in a good place, and we all can and we all should take credit for that. We have accomplished a great deal working together. We have maintained our AAA bond rating, put more money in our reserves for a rainy day, and made smart investments in Virginia's long-term growth. We approved dedicated transportation funding this year, which will make I-81 safer and more reliable while providing much-needed revenue for transportation projects in other parts of the state as well. We work together to attract new business to the state, notably Amazon, which is ahead of schedule in hiring and has submitted its development plans for its national landing campus. Virginia Tech will offer courses in their new Alexandria location next fall. I want to thank Delegate Rush for his work with Tech and thank all of you for the bipartisan work that went into this project. We took a huge step to reduce the criminalization of poverty by ending the practice of suspending driver's licenses for unpaid court costs and fees. As I have traveled the state to bring awareness to this issue, people have told me how much this means to them. We found agreement on how to pay for a long overdue rebuilding of Central State Hospital. We gave our teachers the largest single-year pay raise in 15 years. We found a bipartisan resolution to the environmental challenge of what to do with 27 million cubic yards of toxic coal ash lying in unlined ponds near our waterways. And we have now enrolled more than 306,000 additional Virginians in Medicaid through the expansion of that program. These people can now access the kind of health care many of us take for granted, helping them lead more productive lives. They can get treatment for chronic conditions. They can get preventive care to help head off health problems before they become serious. And they can access treatment for addiction and other behavioral health issues. This access is saving lives, and we made this happen together. We did all of these things together, working across the aisle, and put our differences aside to serve the people of Virginia. We have opportunities to continue this good work in the session and budget ahead. But first, let me update you on the financial health of our Commonwealth for the budget year that recently ended. By and large, our financial health is good. We ended the year with a surplus of $797.7 million. But as is often the case, much of that surplus is already obligated for items like water quality and taxpayer relief. We also are putting $344.4 million into reserves, which means by 2021, we'll have $1.6 billion in our reserves, approximately 7% of our general fund revenue, the highest amount we have ever put in our reserves. This is something that we should all be proud of. Last year, I mentioned that putting 8% of our revenues into reserves is a goal of our administration, and we're well on our way to that path. We expect revenues to grow in the coming year. I want to thank all of the economists, business leaders, and General Assembly members who volunteer to help provide our consensus revenue forecast. This is important work, and I want to thank Secretary Aubrey Lane for his steady guidance. Aubrey, thank you. While our revenues are positive, we also must plan for mandatory expenditures. For example, we are due to re-benchmark our standards of quality in the coming biennium. This is critical to ensure that our schools and school funding keep pace with our students' needs so that every child receives a quality education. But it comes with a price tag. We also know that our Medicaid program is likely to be more costly next year as health care costs across the board continue to rise. I and our administration are keenly aware of the issue of rising health costs and will continue to work with you on solutions. We also continue the work to build up our community-based behavioral health services, which provide critical support to many Virginians and their families, and we know there are costs to that work. Over the past few years, we have invested and will continue to invest in strengthening our community service boards and ensuring that the services they provide are the same across the state. I also, Senator Norman, want to take a moment to thank Dr. Hughes Melton for his work at our Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. That work must and will continue. I ask that we have a moment of silence in memory of Dr. Melton and of Haley Green, who both lost their lives in a tragic accident. Thank you. As we go into this new budget cycle, we must be cautious and strategic. Our unemployment rate remains at 2.9%. Our employers continue to add jobs, but because we are close to full employment, our job growth has slowed. And though we are in the 12th year of economic expansion, we know that that can't last forever. Federal policies continue to affect us. For example, the trade war with China and its resulting tariffs have already led to drastic cutbacks on purchases of American agricultural products, which hurt our farmers in Virginia. China used to be the #1 destination for Virginia's agriculture and forestry exports, such as soybeans. In 2016, we exported nearly $700 million in those products to China. But because of the trade war, our agricultural exports to China have lost nearly 2/3 of their value, resulting in hundreds of millions of dollars of lost revenue for Virginia farmers. Sales of soybeans are now just $235 million, and China has dropped to our #2 agricultural trading partner. Personally, we have soybeans growing on our family farm this year on the Eastern Shore, and they may very well stay in the fields if they can't be sold. The farmers that I grew up with would much rather sell at a profit than rely on federal subsidies. We live in a global economy these days, and that means what happens on a global scale also happens at the local level. As the national economy slows, Virginia's economy is expected to slow as well. We're fortunate that Congress has resolved the issue of sequestration, at least for now. But fiscal policy and the accumulation of significant federal debt, now over $22 trillion and growing every day, will continue to be a drag on consumers and our economy. To best prepare the Commonwealth for the future, we must continue to protect our AAA bond rating, diversify our economy, and make strategic investments in our long-term success. We must ensure that Virginia has the strongest foundation possible. In the 21st century, broadband is like electricity. It is a necessity of modern life. The projects we have supported are bringing broadband connections to nearly 70,000 homes and businesses so far across the Commonwealth, and we will continue to work on this important issue. I thank you all for the additional dollars we put into the Housing Trust Fund in the last budget, but we can and must do more for affordable housing. We must continue our investment in education, from early childhood through higher education and skills training. Every Virginian deserves access to a high-quality and affordable education. Making sure that every child has access to opportunity means starting early. Last month, I signed Executive Directive 4, establishing the Executive Leadership Team on School Readiness. That team will work to ensure that all at-risk 3- and 4-year-olds have access to quality, affordable early childhood education options. I want to thank the First Lady for her work and leadership on this issue. Thank you. There is an obvious overlap between investments in education and investments in our workforce. Our administration continues to work with our community colleges and the entire higher education system to build bridges between education, skills training, and the high-demand jobs we need to fill and want to continue to attract. We want Virginians to be able to get the skills they need for good jobs. This fall, I'll be having conversations about these workforce pathways in our communities, talking to our higher education partners, our businesses, and our local leaders to see what our communities need. We want to make absolutely sure we continue to support our world-class workforce and educational systems, both of which helped make Virginia the best state in the nation in which to do business. One of my proudest days as governor was to be at Shenandoah River State Park for the announcement that CNBC had named our Commonwealth, Virginia, the best state for business. Over the years, we have moved steadily from 13th to 7th to 4th, and now back to our rightful place at number 1. This is an achievement for every one of us, and it comes because we have all worked together. My top priority as governor is making sure that every Virginian, no matter who you are or where you live, is able to fully participate in our economic growth. By diversifying our economy, investing in our workforce, and keeping a stable and open business climate, I am proud to report that our administration has secured extensive new investment and jobs across the Commonwealth. That includes Premier Tech in your district, Chairman Norman, 20 jobs and almost $2 million of investment in King and Queen County. It includes Merck in Chairman Hanger's district, 152 jobs and $1 billion of investment in Rockingham County. In areas of Suffolk, represented by Chairman Jones, Target is investing $2.8 million to expand its distribution center, bringing 225 new jobs. Volvo Trucks in Delegate Rush's district plans to invest $400 million and create 777 new jobs in Pulaski. In Senator Howe's district, Appian invested $28 million to expand its headquarters to McLean, bringing 600 jobs. While Senator Howe couldn't be here today, we certainly wish her a speedy recovery. In Chesapeake, Delegate Hayes' district, Cloverleaf Cold Storage invested $21 million to create 33 new jobs. In Senator Ruff's district, in Dinwiddie, Richland's Creamery is investing $1.7 million in creating 17 new jobs. And in Portsmouth, in Senator Lucas's district, Preferred Freezer has invested $60 million to create 60 new jobs. There are similar stories across the state, from a large company like Amazon to a small-town Main Street shop with 5 employees. Every business contributes to the fabric of Virginia. Every dollar of investment and every job created means more Virginians can put a roof over their head, put food on their table, and sleep soundly at night, knowing they are able to support themselves and their families. That's why I'm thrilled to announce today that over the last 20 months, we have secured 378 new economic development projects that will bring over $20.3 billion in investment. $20.3 billion is a record. The $20 billion of investment is more than any previous administration has announced in a full 4-year term, and we have achieved this significant milestone in less than half of that time. I am proud of what that means for Virginia, and I am equally proud that $2.7 billion of this investment is in distressed communities around the Commonwealth that have often been overlooked by these types of investment. These economic development projects will create more than 51,000 new jobs, including over 8,700 new jobs in distressed communities. We couldn't do this without our local, legislative, and state economic development partners. I want to particularly thank Secretary Brian Ball and his Commerce and Trade team, as well as Stephen Murray and his team at VEDP for their efforts to promote the Commonwealth and its communities as ideal locations for business. Thank you, Secretary Ball. And I want to thank all of you. We have done strong work to attract business and jobs and ensure that we have a diverse economy that is strong enough to weather headwinds. As I travel the globe on trade missions, businesses are excited about locating or expanding in Virginia. We also must continue to do the work needed to make Virginia a more welcoming and inclusive place, ensuring that a person's race, income level, or place of birth doesn't keep them from accessing a world-class education, quality health care, or business opportunities. I have spent the past several months traveling the Commonwealth, listening to leaders and everyday Virginians share the daily inequities that they face. As we prepare this budget, I will prioritize initiatives that level the playing field for small, women, and minority-owned businesses, reduce the unacceptable racial disparity in Virginia's maternal and neonatal mortality rate, and ensure equal access to a world-class education. Ensuring that Virginia is a welcoming place to live also means continuing to work to make sure that this is a safe place. As we meet here this morning, the Virginia Crime Commission has also been meeting to take up gun safety legislation that we have proposed for years and introduced again for the special session I called earlier this summer after the tragic mass shooting in Virginia Beach. Universal background checks, extreme risk protective orders, one gun a month laws, and tougher penalties for people who leave loaded guns around children are a few of the common sense proposals that we have made. I know where many of you stand on these issues, but I also know that we have an opportunity to come together to save lives. I hope we will seize that opportunity. As we look to this next budget, we're seeing larger requests for security funding, for state buildings, and from outside groups. Already, for fiscal year 2020, we doubled the money in our school security equipment fund. And we've had 133 state employees spend 4 hours each in active shooter training since July 1. Those are resources we'd rather spend on other priorities, but our refusal to address gun violence requires us to instead prioritize self-protection. We have made good choices together that led CNBC to award us that #1 ranking. And we have made good choices together to invest in our infrastructure and our educational systems. We can continue to make good choices. From economic development to our spending priorities, we have seen that when we work together, we can build a better Virginia. When we invest in our people and our places, our roads, and the education and training people need to get good jobs, we thrive in Virginia. No matter what happens in the coming months and years, we are laying a strong foundation for Virginia to weather stormy days and prosper on sunny ones. I look forward to continue to build upon that foundation in the upcoming session. Thank you all so much. Have a great day. Thank you, sir.
After that modest overview, we're now going to head from the economic guru, the Honorable Aubrielle Lane, as Secretary of the Finance, who's going to review the general fund revenues and Virginia's economy for the fiscal year 2019. Secretary Lane, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. pleasure to be here today. I'll try to expand on what the governor said, and I'll try to keep that relatively brief. As we look at what we want to talk about today, it really can be defined into two areas. First of all, I'm going to speak a little bit about how we ended up the year, and of course a big part of that will be the tax policy adjustments the General Assembly made and how that was impacted in the revenues. We'll talk about a little bit about reserves and where that money went to. And then we'll look forward regarding what we might expect not only in this coming year, but in the upcoming budget cycle. So while there's a lot of material, those are really the two topics that I'm going to go through today. First of all, take a look at how we compare to the national economy and to how we predicted we would do this past year. If you look at Virginia's performance, unfortunately, for the third year in a row, we have trailed the national economy. Now, part of that was because we were coming out of a recession, and defense spending is such a big part of our economy. The Budget Act last year really helped a lot when sequestration was limited, so we've picked up, but we still trail the national economy. There was a report by Chimera Economics about this in the Richmond Times-Dispatch a few days ago, and where they pointed out a couple of the reasons had to do with defense spending, but also slower growth, particularly in Northern Virginia, which has been the primary generator of jobs for us over the last few years, and pointing out that the graying of Virginia is projected by 2040, about 2040. Yes, I'm in that group too, Senator. That over 20% of us will be 65 years or older, which basically is what the governor said. We've been at full employment because of these structural differences in our economy for the last couple of years. Unemployment rate's been under 3% for a lot of those years, and so in effect, we've been at full employment, and that has been sort of a depressing effect on our ability to add jobs. And that's, if you look at that, our growth in jobs was less than 1%. We were 0.9%. We only predicted we would grow 1.4%, but we actually grew a little bit less than that. And that is substantially behind the employment growth of 1.7% at the federal level. So in that regard. So still working our way out, but until we get some of this additional workers in the workplace, I think things like Amazon are going to help this. That's going to be something that we're going to have to take into account. Now, we did have a positive growth in personal income. We were up 3.6%. However, we were projecting to grow over 4%. And we still lag the national economy in that. But that did lead primarily to the withholding increases. Almost 60% of our budget, a little over 60% with withholding, was positive for the year. So that's a little bit about put in context how we're growing as compared not only to the nation, but we were projected we would grow. Now, when you put this all together, the good news is that for the most part, we did make our budget. And of course, the governor mentioned we had a record $797.7 million surplus, or Senator Norman, I know you like to have that expressed as revenues over expenditures.
We don't have surpluses, Mr.
Yes,
Secretary.
Sir. Yes, sir. But when you look at that, that was all planned because it primarily dealt with tax policy. We knew we had to get approximately $450 to $500 million over our budget to fund the Taxpayer Relief Fund. And the other part had to do with wealth generation. As you all recall, when we budget non-withholding, the most volatile piece of our revenue stream, we put a collar on that. We don't let it grow but so much, and I'll have a chart on that as to why we do that. But we were expecting a couple $100 million more in wealth generation from our economic models, and we got that. Doesn't mean we're going to get it every year, but we got it this year. So primarily, most of the surplus was planned and not related to the core revenue streams of sales tax and withholding. In fact, if you look at those, they were slightly behind budget. They were $37 million behind budget on a $16.5 billion budget. So we were very close. I think we had a very good consensus estimate, but they didn't quite make it. They're right on budget. So when you look at our underlying growth, we're slightly below what we thought. So while it's good news that we do have more of these excess in revenues this year that has gone into the three categories of water quality and reserves and taxpayer relief. I do not believe that is going to be a sustainable event going forward. But in terms of where we ended up this past year, it was pretty much exactly what we predicted. Now, when you go through this, again, this is just a track of the general fund revenues. Yes, sir.
Mr. Secretary, I think it's important for everyone to go back and kind of revisit what you just said about the non-withholding. Because in 2014, if you recall, you were Secretary of Transportation at the time, we had a $400 and some million surprise in May, basically.
That's correct. Yes,
and
sir.
what we learned from that, talking with, I think, Secretary Brown, our money committee staffs, came up with the whole idea of putting a collar on those revenues. So, because we had anticipated those revenues the year before, there was tax policy changes, and we ended up being $400 and some million short, which meant we had to go in and make adjustments to the budget.
Almost a $2 billion deficit we had to cover in the first year of the McAuliffe administration.
To Chairman Norman's point, it's not really a surplus. These really were anticipated revenues above what we were planning, and they're really spoken for in the sense of tax relief and the above. That's why we want to put them into cash reserves for that rainy day that's going to be coming.
Yes, sir. That is exactly right. And I have a graph on it later to explain exactly those anomalies that we've shown, Chairman Jones. But you're right. We did expect this. In fact, if we hadn't, I'll go to the next chart, if we hadn't grown at least 5.5%, we would not have been able to fund the Taxpayer Relief Fund. So again, this chart here just basically shows how they came in. And of course, a lot of it came in April and May from non-withholding because, remember, we made the policy adjustment in late February. It came into effect. Tax season wasn't delayed, but it started a little bit later. And so people didn't have a chance to adjust their withholdings, and they paid it in estimated taxes, which comes through non-withholding. And that's what those big receipts are in April and May. And the good news is we were right on our targets. We knew what the policy changes that we made, and I want to thank the tax department and my staff who are working through this. I've got a little more detail on this later, but I'm comfortable that we gave good information to the General Assembly to make these adjustments. Now, when we look at the next major section, which is payroll withholding, this is a large section of our revenues, and they represent really the underlying economic strength of the Commonwealth. And as you can see, we were slightly below budget. We grew at 3.6%. We were anticipating to go at 3.8%. That goes back to that fourth graph I showed you on our job growth of less than 1% and the wage increases in that. The issue that we'll deal with going forward, and I'll come back to this later, is we're expecting to grow this category at a greater clip in this current year than we did last year. And I think that could pose some issues for us when we go through the reforecast. But the good news is last year we came very close. And in fact, if you look at July, which I'll get to, we were up in July. That could have been some timing that related to this month. So in fact, we were pretty close to what the budget had. But again, it was right on the budget. We did not exceed it in that regard. So we'll have to take into account, looking forward, the restrictions we have on job growth and making sure our forecast for the coming year is realistic. Now, this is a little bit about where that job growth came. And the good news to this table is, if you look at the right side, every category in the Commonwealth did have job growth. In fact, the top areas shaded in green are services, and that is, quite frankly, where the biggest part of our economy is growing in services in that regard. I'm not going to get into tax policy here, but as we look forward, how revenues sometime in the future, we're going to have to talk about this as we transition our economy more to services out of manufacturing. I'm not suggesting we don't manufacturing jobs, but our tax structure is not set up for the Commonwealth to continue to increase revenues at the same clip because of what's going on in our economy. And please don't say I'm saying we should do anything with services. I'm just pointing out right now that we're having a divergence as we go in that. But other thing I wanted to point out, I'll call your attention to the bottom of the page. The growth came in large payers, large businesses. It grew at 6.2%. That's that bottom green line. Those large payers, like Dominion, like Altria, are not totally dependent on Virginia's economy. They're either regionally or have national implications. They grow at a faster clip than look at the small payers, which are more reflective of the Virginia economy. They only grew at 1.3%. So small businesses in the Commonwealth are not faring as well as the large businesses in the Commonwealth. And I think that goes back to, we've talked about this before, if you were to go look at where they are between the urban areas and the rural areas. Because a lot of the big payers are in those urban areas, they're faring better than some of our rural areas in that. Really excited about some of the things that are going on in Secretary Ball's area about finding jobs in these areas, because that's where I believe we need to concentrate if we're going to really move Virginia's economy forward. We've got to get the rural areas and the small businesses clipping along like some of the larger businesses are in the Commonwealth. Now, Chairman Jones brought this point out, and this is down to with non-withholding, and I probably should have gone and circled back in 2001 also. What I was trying to point out here is this: what a volatile revenue source this is. Okay. Volatile revenue source this is. And you can see we've had very big years and very lean years, because this is tied to wealth generation. It all depends on either selling businesses or selling stocks and bonds, some type of capital event. Those tend to get accentuated around tax policy changes. So if you go back and look at 13, you all recall what happened in 2012, the Bush tax cuts expired at that end of that year. So people who had pent up capital gains sold them, and therefore we got a large influx of capital gains or wealth generation tax. Unfortunately, we thought that was going to continue in the next year, and we budgeted for it, and it didn't happen. You can see in 14, we had a significant decrease, and that was that $2 billion hole in the budget that we all had to go through in the first years of the McAuliffe administration. So this is the point that I wanted to stress is, while we had a surplus this year, it was again related to tax policy. And if you go back and look at the end of 2001, the same thing. We had tax policy changes, the dot-com bubble. We had a very significant decrease in non-withholding in the next year. Now, we compensate for this because we put what's called a collar. We look at non-withholding growth over an average of about 10 years, and there's a couple of different gyrations we go through, but it limits it so we don't budget this. If we get it, it shows up as surplus. But if you look at our history, the chances are we're not going to see the same wealth generation this year that we saw last year, and where we budget, we won't count on it in that regard. So that is also going to be something to look at as we go through reforecasting. A large part of this surplus came in this volatile revenue source that we will not forecast, will repeat in going forward. But again, it was good for this year. It helped us build our reserves. And it was anticipated. The tax policy provisions you put in place, and I'll go through later, were right on what we expected to happen. Now, this really identifies that this whole policy of non-withholding is really attributable to about 1,000 people in the Commonwealth. The 1,000 largest payers who give us $100,000 or more on their last estimated payment. And you can see those tend to be 300, 400, 500 people, and they'd be a couple $100 million a year. But look at 13. 884 people paid us $327 million. And in this past year, 1,195 people paid us $463 million. You can see the next year they didn't do that. So it really comes down to monitoring this group of about 1,000 people. I know most of y'all are in this group, so I'll keep that in there. But that's really what it comes down to, and we'll monitor this. But again, my best advice will be we're not going to repeat this year coming up. So again, just want to make sure we're not just saying this because we're trying to be conservative. It's been the history of what's happened with tax policy changes here across the Commonwealth. Now, another significant area that impacts us, almost 16 or 17% of our general revenues, after non-withholding, the next largest source, not counting the non-withholding, but after withholding, is sales tax. And we were slightly behind the budget. We had projected to be at 3.7%, and we were only about 3.4%. What's concerning about this is if you look at the last sentence in that graph here, sales taxes, which are bricks and mortars in the stores, only increased 2.7%. We got the increase from use taxes or internet taxes. So what's concerning about this is whether or not we've gotten that hit that we were expecting to hit this year with the Wayfair legislation, whether or not we've already seen this. And in fact, we're expecting this revenue source to grow more in this year than it did in last year. And again, I think that's something we'll need to keep into effect or in mind as we go through the reforecasting process going forward. But again, not significantly behind. I'll point out here that if you look at the three bars to the left, that was last July, August, September of last year. Remember what happened earlier that year? The budget was signed, tax cuts were put in place. We were coming off pretty much a sugar high, and we had a really good selling season. Well, I'll get into July. That didn't happen in July of this year. The tax cuts have worn off from the federal level. So this is a source we'll have to make sure we really monitor. We're going up against some pretty strong numbers, and we're expecting to grow on top of that. So again, not saying anything is wrong, but it's just that in terms of being cautious of how we look forward in our outlook. Now, if you look at the other revenue sources for the year, excuse me, in putting in tax policy, either one of two things could have happened. We could have paid us more in taxes, or we could have got lesser refund. And that's what part of the citizens happened. They got refunds were actually down, which is a positive to our revenue, because people had to pay more in state taxes. So it either came through the non-withholding or through refunds. Again, another case where I don't know this is going to be repeated next year in terms of the reduction of how the refunds come in. So that'll take count into as we go through the reforecast. One area that continues to concern, and it may be a timing difference, is that's corporate income taxes. We did not make it last year. In July, when I get to it, we still did not see a bounce back. Now, many of them don't file until August, September, so not sounding the alarm yet, but we're on a trend now where corporate taxes, remember, at the beginning of last year, we had this large increase, and we were even talking about maybe we should book some of it. Well, it didn't materialize, and we still continued to trend off, and I think that goes back to that graph I showed you earlier. Virginia corporations still are only growing about 1.3%, or the ones that are totally reliant on our economy. So that's something we have to keep our eye on. We did have some positive news in recordation taxes. We expected interest rates to go up, and they went down. So the good news is mortgages and housing market held up better, particularly in Richmond and Northern Virginia than in other areas. So we didn't go down as much in recordation taxes as we thought we were. In fact, last year at this time, if you wanted to go get a 30-year mortgage, it cost you 5%. Today, you can get it at 3.75%. So that's a positive in terms if you're looking for a home, and that helped us get additional recordation taxes that we're not anticipating. Insurance premium taxes, which are the corporate income taxes on insurance companies, about in line. Don't see anything in here that's significant. Now, one other thing that Secretary Ballin wants me to talk about, and I do this every year for you, and that's the Commonwealth Trust Fund transportation revenues for last year. The good news is we did make it again on our budget, but it wasn't because of gasoline or fuel taxes. It was because of vehicle sales. If you look at that, vehicle sales were up $62.5 million, and motor fuels tax were actually down $46.8 million. The issue is if we end up a slowing economy, we're not going to get those car sales, and this decrease in motor fuel taxes is going to become more prevalent. In fact, if you look at this next graph, it graphs what we've done in this area. Just these are collection of motor fuel taxes in the Commonwealth, the state tax. And even from 2013, when you guys took the courageous act to increase these revenues, all we've done is gotten back pretty much to those levels. In those years where it was down, we used bonding to offset that loss, and in terms of continuing construction, don't have that availability anymore. But what concerns me is that vehicle miles traveled here continue to increase, yet our regional and our gas taxes continue to go down. In fact, I was talking to somebody this morning, it might have been Senator Hanger, who pulled into a Sheetz, or someone was, and they've got the electric charging station over there for the electric vehicles. That's all good, but we're not getting a piece of that at all. Maybe it was Delegate Landis maybe told me that. We're not getting a piece of that at all. So this is another area where we're going to have to look at if we're going to continually to support roads in the Commonwealth in that.
Okay. Excuse me, Secretary Lane.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Southwell.
Our gasoline tax is at 16.1 cents a gallon. How many states have a lower state gasoline tax than us?
I only think it's 3 or 4, and it's 2. It's down to 2 now. It was about 2 or 3, yes,
Yeah,
sir.
and the national average is about 31.
And I know North Carolina's double what we are.
Yeah,
a little
they're
over
more than
double
double
what
what we
yes,
are.
sir.
But the average price of their retail regular unleaded in the first 3 weeks of July, I haven't checked it since then, statewide was only $0.015 more than ours was. And the reason,
competition.
Well, it's not so much that. It's been my observation over the years that the major oil companies don't seem to allow a wide state-by-state separation, which means, in effect, we are helping to finance the roads in North Carolina because their jobber distributors are buying that gasoline from the major oil companies a lot cheaper than the major oil companies are selling it to us in Virginia. And I once asked a general manager, it was Amoco at the time, who had 5 or 6 states, under him about this, and he said to me, Saslaw, he says it's not. He says it was kind of crude, but he said he wasn't responding. He says if your people weren't, and he said something else, smart enough to raise the gasoline tax, don't blame me.
Well,
it was an observation made by an executive at a major oil company.
Well, I believe we're going to have to use all our resources because we have so many needs in that. I will point out here, though, we just announced, I think it was GM and forgot the other one, who are not even going to make hybrids. They're going right to electric vehicles. They're even skipping going to hybrids. So I just bring this up because what we've used to date have been 2 sources of revenue to offset this. Right. Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, and now looks like in the 81 quarter we've had some regional taxes that have helped. But tolls are getting close to almost as much that we're collecting in the state as state gasoline taxes. So one way or the other, if Virginians are paying for it, we probably need to have the conversation on what is the best way for that to happen as we go forward. And I'm not making any determination what's right or wrong. I'm just saying if we don't have the revenue sources, we won't have roads. Now, the governor did also mention how this surplus went. And Senator Norman, at a previous meeting, you asked me, was there any way could the administration obligate this surplus, and to which I answered no. And that is exactly the right answer, what happened here. Of the $797 million, and I'll get to this, $455 million has gone into taxpayer relief, and the remainder went into water quality and the cash reserves, which is what the budget language required. So the governor mentioned that there were $344.4 million. It's made up of 2 parts, a $73.6 million to the stabilization fund, the rainy day fund, and the $270.8 million going to the cash reserves. And then on top of that, between water quality A and B, $47 million went into those, which are statutory, how we are accounted for as we go through this. So none of those monies are appropriated other into these buckets of money going forward in that. I will mention in the last 2 years, between this year and last year, not only have we put record money into reserves, but we've put over $121 million into water quality. So significant investment into water quality going forward. So Senator Norman, that's where those monies went. They were not obligated and went into these pots of money, which will be something that will be discussed this coming year in the budget and the legislative cycle. And speaking of reserves, the governor mentioned this. This is how it breaks down. By the year of 2021, we'll have approximately $600 million in the stabilization fund and over $900 million in reserves. And these monies are reserved on the balance sheet, so they will go in. And I think this is going to be important. You'll have some flexibility if, in fact, we do go through a slowdown. You'll have some flexibility in how we manage that, where a couple years ago we didn't have that flexibility. So I think that's been a wise use, and I appreciate working with the legislature and the governor in putting these monies aside so that we can have a more predictability about core functions of government going forward in terms of the spending. Now, the real thing that happened this year that was unusual was tax conformity and taxpayer relief refunds. And in fact, this slide here you've seen before. I just wanted to remind you of what the budget required us to do, and that is to put all the monies related to tax policy adjustments this year into the taxpayer relief fund so that we could give refunds of $110 for individuals and $220 for couples who filed by July 1st of this year. That was what the budget required. It also required the governor to certify those revenues before September 1st. And I can say the governor hasn't put his pen to it, but the state controller has certified them to give to the governor because we've had the report done. Now, this was a timeline of how all this was going to happen. Again, remind you, you've seen this slide before. Everything to the left of this horizontal line, vertical line, the black line here, has been performed. So we did everything we said we were going to do, had those revenues certified. All we have now is to issue the checks, and they will start between September 16th and October 15th. Some 2.7 million checks are anticipated to go out, and it's going to take us 4 weeks to get them out in there. I was going to start to say we were going to make sure we got these all out by November 18th, but I understand there's an election before then, so I just decided to keep to the schedule you required me to do. So anyway, so they'll be all out by October 15th in there. Now, the law required the governor to certify, and what we decided to do is to have a third party that was not the consultant that we used to do tax policy to verify what part of these revenues were wealth generation and what part of these revenues related to tax conformity or tax policy adjustments. Remember in Cambridge, last year we used Cambridge, who used our 2015 returns and did simulations, which we worked with the money committee and your staff, worked with those to determine not only the impacts to Virginia we anticipated, but also what we thought tax policy adjustments in the future would do. Now, we did not use Cambridge to do the certification. We used Ernst & Young. I wanted somebody that was independent, that didn't just say, well, what we said we did, we did. I wanted an independent review of that. And we're going to do this the same way as last year. Your staff, it's open. It's on my website, the whole report. Happy to go through and detail everything about that as you go through and analyze it. But to make sure we were getting the true wealth generation, we had to start from 2017, right? Because if you started from 2015, people had pay increases, and we wouldn't give them credit for that. So we compared the 2018 actual returns that were filed this past year to 2017, overlaying what Cambridge and the General Assembly's tax policy directives were to determine the impact between wealth generation and what was tax policy. So I'm just going to go through some of the highlights today, and of course this whole report is there for you to review and your staffs can tear through it. But Ernst & Young depicted $455 million was received due to the TCJA, or Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, provisions related to policy. Just so you can compare to that, Cambridge predicted $532 million of that. So they were a little bit less, and there's reasons for that, and I'll go through those. The most significant part of related to policy had to do with what we'll call affectionately switchers. Those who were itemized deductions in the past that may take the standard deduction in the future. If you look at that third bullet there, Ernst & Young said there were 22% of people that were impacted. Cambridge on 15 data said there were only 15% that were impacted by that. But we can explain those differences. First of all, Cambridge said it would optimize, the assumption used, it would optimize the greatest return you would receive between the federal and the state. In other words, it would do the computation, and what is the greatest between those two, that's how it would compute the return. I will tell you, most Virginians did not do that. Many Virginians just optimized what the greatest federal return was to them regardless of whether or not they were paying more between the two in state taxes. Part of that was because we were late making policy. The software people couldn't make these changes. And also a lot of it had to do because the differences weren't that great. Chambridge said if you got $1 better, then they said you would do what was the best thing to do. You would file what was the best way. People don't look at that. They probably said for $1, I'm not going to do this. You know, for $10, I may not do this. But there were some that really left some money on the table. But if you look at the dollar value between these two pools that were predicted, Ernst & Young said it was $399 million for policy, and Chambridge predicted $385. So the pots were pretty close. The difference was a lot of people said, I'm not going to do this for $1 or $2. In fact, 64% of those people that switched made less than $100,000. So it didn't make much difference, $5 or $10 either way, and they said, I'm not going to pay to have my state return done a different way or what have you. So the good news is what the dollar value of what we thought they would be was about the same. And we can explain the difference because many people said it's just not worth it for me to go through and have to make this computation. And I will also say there will be some this year that will do that because they will figure out they paid more than they should have. But in terms of the total pot, they were very close. The other two issues that were significant in the $455 million, there was $62 million that Ernst & Young predicted related to business loss that you couldn't take back anymore, business losses. Chambridge actually predicted $142 million, so it wasn't as much as Chambridge predicted. That could be a timing difference. It could be people want extension. We know that Chambridge used 3.6 million returns. Ernst & Young only used 3.4. The reason being is because we do have about 250,000 people each year that go on extension. For 2015, we didn't have to worry about that. But in the last number of any significance was inflation, the inflation measures that went through. Ernst & Young predicted 5 million, Chambridge 14. But in general, they were very close. So I'm very comfortable that what we gave you to use and what actually happened was significantly what we expected. So $455 million went into the taxpayer relief fund this year of the $797 million. By the way, that leaves about 300 or 250 million roughly in wealth generation. Go back to that original graph where I told you we were predicting 213 million if we hadn't put the collar in place. So that makes a lot of common sense to me also. In other words, if you look at it from a 30,000 foot level, this makes a lot of sense as to how this came out. So that money went in the taxpayer relief fund, and we project $431 million will be paid out between September 16th and October 15th, and maybe a little bit longer, depending on if your turn has to be reviewed. So substantially, most of it will be paid back. The remaining $25 million will remain in that taxpayer relief fund unobligated. So that money will be in that fund to be decided this year in this year's budget how to be spent, but it remains in that fund. So in general, overall, very pleased with Ernst & Young confirming what we thought was going to happen and the amount of impact to taxpayers. In fact, if we go to the next page here, this is a summary of if you took the $466 million, I should have mentioned the way the budget read, the $466 million had to be reduced by the business provisions, which was $11 million. That gives you the $455. But of the $466, the average taxpayer in the Commonwealth paid an additional $125. Now, there are lots of weighted averages you can look at up and down, and some people paid more and some people paid less. But that also fits right in with your decision to give $110 and $220 back to individuals. This $125 on average is about how most people were impacted. Now, depending on your income level, it was different. If you made less than $50,000, you had to pay an average of $39.86 more. If you were between 75 and 150, it was $164.72. And if you're one of the fortunate ones that made over $175,000, then you had to pay $356 more this year in state income taxes than last year in that. And that, if you go back and look at the tables that Chamber's done, comparably compares to those income breakdowns in that regard. So, Mr. Chairman, I do not see any significant surprises here. What the General Assembly said they would do, as you recall, we said Virginia taxpayers were going to be somewhere around $400 million. We're giving $421 million back. I think we've made them whole this past year. It may not be on an individual basis, but on an aggregate basis, the Virginia taxpayers were made whole. Going forward, the process will be similar with a couple of exceptions. The monies related to wealth generation will go through the same calculation, but remember, you guys made policy adjustments. You raised the standard deduction, and you decoupled to the SALT. So the impact will not be nearly as great this coming year. And plus, I think a lot of people will also figure out, they'll do the computation between whether I should do better federal or state. So that will have to be taken into account. But to the extent there are monies coming out of this, if they're related to tax policy, they will go into the taxpayer relief fund. Anything with wealth generation would go into surplus, or the normal calculation that we go through, cash reserves, has to go into one of those categories. The peace amendment piece are the ones that the budget said could go either into taxpayer relief or to reserves. The budget's not clear. That'll have to be resolved this year going forward. But any of this money related to this will either go into reserves or into the taxpayer relief fund again next year in that regard. So that's a general overview. My message today is that we did not see any major surprises, and the policy adjustments, the results you thought would happen, did happen in what the actions taken this year in that. Now, that explains what got us through last year, where the monies came from, and where we're headed. This slide takes us from last year looking forward into the current budget cycle. And this is where I need to give a little bit of explanation. Because remember last year when we did tax policy, Chairman Jones brought this up, those revenues were not put in the revenue tract. In other words, we didn't put them in the budget. They were specifically set aside to go into taxpayer relief fund. But when they actually came in, they came through revenues, which generated the surplus. So when you look at this year, where we put $21.96 million in the bank, $1 billion in the bank, and you look at this coming year, where we're only expected to put $22.2 billion in the bank, you're thinking, gosh, we only have to grow 1%, and we're going to be okay. That is not an accurate statement. That $797 million is not repeatable. In fact, I've highlighted the two green areas that I talked about before. Withholding and sales and use tax are expected to grow this year at 4.2%, and they didn't grow anywhere near that in the last year. And those monies that we got from tax policy are not going to be repeated for the reasons I stated regarding the non-withholding collar and how we go through this computation. So the message here is that we're actually probably going to have less revenues than we thought this year. And I would expect, unless our trends change, that when we go through the forecast this year, we may be cut a little bit. So this is the word of caution here. I'm not suggesting what that amount's going to be, but I know unless our trends change, that's one of the things we look at. And we're expected to grow at a greater clip this year than last year. And with some of the things that we're seeing in the economy, I'm not sure that's sustainable. So that is just a word of big caution. We won't know this until we get through that. But I didn't want everybody to think, oh, we got all this money, we only have to grow 1%, and we're in high cotton. That is not going to be the case this year. In fact, I think it's actually going to be a fairly difficult cycle, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So looking a little bit going forward, let's talk about what happened in July just quickly. This is all to be determined. You can see we now know what the U.S. is projected to grow next year in that and we'll compare that as we go through the forecasting process as what we'll come up with. But as I've shown the last 3 years, we have lagged the national growth. And if you look at some of the things we're considering, they're actually growing faster than the national growth, and that has not been our history. But we'll determine that as we go through the forecasting process. Just a couple of things to highlight where we stand. The governor mentioned some of these. I won't go through all of them. We'll just point out again, we are at full employment. In that is going to be a drag. I think we've got some things in place in the coming years to help out migration with our tech talent pipeline, Amazon, that's going to happen, but I don't think that's going to help much in the next 12 to 18 months in that. I'll again point out down below the tariffs. The governor mentioned tariffs. If all the tariffs were to be enacted that the President Trump has announced, it would cost us $128 billion. The tax cuts that he put in were $122 billion. So they would exceed the benefit from the tax cuts if they're all enacted. Fortunately, the last few days, he's pulled back on some of those, and I think that's good for us. If you look at the recent report by the Virginia Council of CEOs, the number one thing they pointed out is the uncertainty in the global and the national market here in Virginia that's causing them to maybe pull back. And I don't even like talking about it because as soon as you talk about it, people repeat it. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the person talking about it most is the president because he's talking about, I'm going to do a payroll tax cut, the Federal Reserve needs to cut. Well, you don't do that unless there's something wrong. So I, again, just point out, only reiterating what I hear, and people tend to act on those type of things. I'll also point out now total household debt, which includes mortgage, credit card, and student debt, now exceed the levels that were experienced before the Great Recession. And I know you read reports that consumers can handle it. They can handle it till they can't. That's what happens in recessions. We're in them before we know. And I think this is putting a really difficult, I've heard this in the Op 6 meetings with the education, middle class are really being hurt here because of this debt, particularly student debt and other things they're doing. Big article in that. Last thing I'll mention on where we stand relates to the Federal Reserve actions. They've cut rates, first time in modern history that we've done a so-called safety rate cut. But we're still growing and we're cutting rates. That is not the sign of a strong economy when you're increasing monetary surplus in the market. So again, I think the more it's talked about, unfortunately, the more it may become a reality. So if you look at July, I need to point out July was not a significant month. I don't think we can read any trends off of this. We were actually up a lot in non-withholding and withholding. That's because we had an extra pay period of one more day that we're going to pay back in August. But what really concerns me is the sales tax. If you look at the third line, we did not grow anywhere near the projection of 4.2%. Actually, we were down 3.8%. It's not significant. We won't know where we get till the end of September. But as you recall, we did not have a great spring in this regard. Yes, sir.
Secretary Lane, was it last year I think I had the same question. We've got the whole data centers and when you can, take your credits for sales tax, for equipment, et cetera, et cetera. We talked about looking at that, said you just don't pay it initially. Is that embedded in some of the numbers in July, or do we know?
It is in the budget. It's embedded because we take that into account. I don't know if it actually. I do know there are some settlements. Where's John? I do know we have some. The accelerated sales tax comes back in this month, so there's some things that could go. We're really going to know. But we certainly take that into account when we budget.
No, we do, but I'm just saying as far as what actually happened, do we know if any, came in with, these are credits that were owed for?
I don't think so of any significance, but I'll get back to you.
No
nothing. Let me put it this way. This year was not any different than last year.
Yep.
In that regard.
Thank you.
So one thing that we need to keep alert on, we really won't know where we stand on this until the end of September, because August is not a very significant month. It's September, we'll know. And as you recall that graph I showed you early, the first 3 months of last year in sales tax, we grew 7.5% each month. So we've got a pretty big hill to climb. So just point that out. But again, we were up. So in terms of money in the bank, that was good, but not up to where we needed to be in the core factors of sales and withholding as we look forward going forward. I'll wrap up quickly with this. I've spent most of the summer going around to a lot of places that are significant users of general fund dollars. I spent a lot of time at mental health, where I know we're experiencing over 100% of the census population, people using our mental health facilities. Department of Corrections, we're 126% of people in the prisons in that regard. Op 6, we're talking about all the education. Believe me, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, there's no shortage of requests from the higher education community coming in this year. Yeah, in that regard. As hard as I've tried, there has been no shortage of those requests in that. But over and above those things we normally have to deal with and those trends, some things I want to put on your radar. We have the annual Medicaid forecast. The governor mentioned this. If that's anywhere near where the history, that's 5 to 7%. That's hundreds of millions of dollars. That's a significant number. Standards of quality re-benchmarking we have to take into account. Again, that's hundreds of millions of dollars. The Virginia retirement system just announced, I know that it was a JLAR committee meeting, that they're looking at reducing their discount rate, which I believe is the appropriate thing to do. In fact, there was a Wall Street Journal article recently where the top pension funds across the state pension funds, retirement funds across the country with $1 billion or more in assets earned an average of 6.79% last year. So we're going to see a trend of this going down. Every quarter point is $96 million a year in general fund dollars. So it'd be a couple $100 million. Federal actions are important. We're seeing a reduction of grants or a more strict compliance through disallowances and penalties. That's starting to be more prevalent, I think, as the federal government deals with its budgetary issues. We have a couple of big agency projects. I didn't want to put VETA on here now. We've talked about that enough, but we're still working through that. But we have another significant human resource system replacement, significant exposure to us as we go through that. I've mentioned transportation funding. I know there's some things that we need to keep on there. The reason I put lottery here, I know you guys probably have just received the letter from Kevin Hall, and for the first time, he denoted these games of skill, supposedly. He estimates we have over 4,300 of these machines now in ABC-allowed bars and restaurants across the Commonwealth, and they're actually moving some of the lottery machines out to put in these machines. So I put lottery. It may be in the bigger form of gaming, but we're going to have to come to grips with this. The last 3 months, if you look, we had a great year in lottery, which is fantastic, but the last 3 months have not been what they were. What's happened in the last 3 months? Rosie's has happened. You saw the hundreds of millions of dollars, and now we have this. So it's something I put out there for us to make sure we understand. And, of course, capital allocation. We are dealing not only with the needs, government, central, state, which is a $300 million project. We have significant deferred maintenance, but for the first time, we saw this starting last year, increased construction costs for 2 reasons. 1, labor shortages, can't find them, and 2, the tariffs. Steel, aluminum, other things have gone up, and they're putting in those projects. So we're going to have to deal, I know of 3 fairly significant projects that are going to be $20 to $30 million more than we projected right off the bat going forward. So just want to get that on your horizon and follow up, ladies and gentlemen. This will be the forecasting process we go through starting in September. Obviously, you're a big part of that. Many of you are on these boards as we go through. John Lehman and Tax, Craig Burns and his team will go through the economic forecast. We'll have in JB and the Business Council, and then it'll come up with the governor's forecast, which we'll present in the budget. So that, Mr. Chairman, completes my presentation unless there's any questions.
Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, I believe we have a question. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Oh, Delegate Bell, excuse me, I'm sorry.
Colonial Downs, is that going to be entered into the lottery area as well now that it's back on?
When you say enter into the lottery area, they're independent, so they're not controlled by the state.
Meaning that the revenue, where would it go?
The revenue goes to a private source. The lottery all goes to education, public use. Colonial Downs does not. It's a private source. There is some benefit to the equestrian community, the horses, in that regard, but nothing to the state. None of these games of skill come to the state. So as we stand now, the JLARC is doing a report. I know, thank you, they came and visited with me. I know they visited with others. I think that's going to be something we're going to have to deal with this coming years.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is any member of either committee? Yes, sir.
Question?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. On page 19, we talked about the $797 million amount variance, which was a result of the change in the federal tax policy, which on the expenditure side, we have done something with this year, and we've actually taken action on tax policy for next year as well.
That's correct.
I still not following exactly the 1% change in our forecast going forward next year requires a 4.2% increase in withholding and sales tax. Would that withholding not go up?
It possibly could. It could, except the federal tables were reduced, as you recall. So it could. But more than likely, what's going to happen is going to come through non-withholding. It could go up if people go in and adjust, but they typically look at the federal tables. So it could. So we might get some of that through withholding. But as you know, a lot of that we increased our deduction and significantly decreased the impact of that. But it could be some of that. Yeah. It could. And that's really, you're exactly right. I know you're a CPA also. And I could be the case. We'll see. But I think, unfortunately, because the federals reduced their amounts taken out, most people tend to follow those guidelines. But it could.
Mr. Secretary, as there's a potential migration of state resources, say, from the lottery to other gaming alternatives, is there anything that would preclude the legislative branch from considering a taxation adjustment on various forms of gaming?
I don't think there's anything. You guys appropriate all the money. I think you're the ones that control the purse strings.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. I want to follow up on a conversation you generated up here on the gas tax issue. So page 11 might be the specific area, but just a quick question on the vehicle sales tax revenues going up at the same time that the gas taxes are either flattening or reducing. And obviously we know the trend of which way we're going. Is there any breakdown as to the sales of electric vehicles versus fuel vehicles and whether that delta makes a difference in that increase? And the reason I'm asking, obviously, is that as we see the trend of having more and more electric vehicles that don't use fuel and we're still pegging our resources and revenues on gas, I wonder if there might be some innovative ways for us to think about the electric vehicle usage.
Had this conversation with John Lehman over here. He'll tell you it's Ford pickup trucks that cost $56,000, $60,000, which are driving the vehicle sales. I mean, not electric, not electric. Now they're a part of it, but it's not electric. It's people, the gasoline being low, people driving those pickup trucks. And if you're going to see a new one, and I have to admit I bought one, they're not cheap. They're not cheap. Hey, it's my money. So that's right. Anyway, but but no, it's really the price of the vehicles. It's not only the units, but it's the price of the vehicles that are going up. And certainly electric vehicles, if you're buying a Tesla and stuff, they are more expensive. That's part. But what's really driving it is SUVs and sales. And if you look at the manufacturers, GM has pretty much said, we're not building combustion engine anymore. They're going to electric. Ford's not taking that tack. Ford has put a lot of their resources into gasoline-powered engines and stuff going forward. So that's going to play out for a while in that regard. But as of right now, it's the price. Gasoline is low. Vehicle miles are being traveled more, having on our highways, and people are still buying SUVs and pickup trucks.
Thank you.
Any further questions of Mr. Secretary? If not, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for your informative presentation. We always enjoy hearing from you, and I'm sure we'll be having some conversations going forward with what the legislative preferences might be.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me today. Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, the committees will rise.
That's your pickup truck?
I don't have a pickup truck. I drive my car that I bought from my mother 5 years ago, 2010 Acura. So I'm paying all that gas.
Bye-bye.
I'll see you Saturday.
Yes, in Hampton?
Yeah.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Do you need an escort? You know,
No, I'm just trying to find somewhere to stay. They didn't have anything in Hampton.
Oh, you're staying overnight. I live
Well,
there.
yeah. So they didn't have anything in Hampton. I'm coming in on Friday.
Okay.
They didn't have anything in Hampton, and so the next place is
Why
Newport
don't you stay
News.
with Joel?